Have you ever wondered what life is like for a young child married to a Muslim Imam? Behind this story, there are secrets you may have never imagined, secrets that will leave you bewildered. In this video, we will take an in-depth look into a world where ancient traditions and customs will surprise you. Even though women's rights are now widely advocated for and protected, especially in the Western world, there are still places where women have little or no voice. Some Muslim women have little or no say in practices such as the virginity test, a procedure conducted to determine if a girl is a virgin before she is sent to her husband's house. In cases where she is found not to be a virgin, she is often ostracized or faces severe consequences. Even acts like speaking to or shaking hands with a man outside of her family are often met with disdain. Child marriage remains a harsh reality in some communities, seemingly upheld by ancient beliefs, with the child's own family sometimes in full support, regardless of the emotional trauma and pain it may cause for the child. This is the story of Halima, a child forced into motherhood at the tender age of 11. She was married off to a wealthy Imam who already had 3 wives. Recounting these events brings tears to my eyes. No child should ever have to endure this kind of hardship. Children are children. They should not be forced to play the role of adults. In the quiet town of Arzen in northern Morocco, people still speak in hushed tones about Halima, a tale of innocence lost, of childhood crushed under the weight of adult demands. Arzen, with its rolling hills and ancient alleys, is where Halima's life began and where it ended. This town, which once felt familiar and comforting, became the setting for an ordeal that would haunt its residents. Welcome to Forbidden Passion. I am glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you are watching from. Halima's life began simply, amid the gentle rhythms of rural Morocco. The town was small, its streets lined with earthen homes, its people bonded by a shared, modest life. In Arzen, everyone knew everyone else, and most families, like Halima's, depended on the land for survival. Halima's family was well respected despite their limited means. Her father, Youssef, was a man rooted in tradition, a local farmer who worked tirelessly from dawn until the sun set. Youssef cultivated crops the way his father had, using nothing more than his hands, simple tools, and the wisdom passed down through generations. For him, life was about providing for his family, and he took pride in the sweat and toil that sustained them. Halima was his only daughter, a small, bright-eyed girl with an inquisitive mind and a quiet demeanor. Her days were filled with helping her mother, Maryam, with chores and learning the family's herbal medicine trade. Maryam was known throughout Arzen for her healing abilities. The townspeople often sought her out for remedies, from coughs and colds to more serious ailments, and Maryam's skills had been inherited from her own mother, passed down like a sacred trust. Halima watched in awe as her mother identified each plant with certainty, mixing leaves, roots, and oils into healing potions. She was an attentive student, picking up her mother's craft with eagerness and care. Maryam often spoke to her daughter about the importance of helping others, of the power of nature's gifts, and the responsibility that came with such knowledge. Life was peaceful, if not entirely carefree. Halima's family, though bonded by love, was a family of limited resources. With 4 sons to feed and clothe, the household often faced tough times. Youssef's crops were at the mercy of the seasons, and some years were harder than others. The family lived humbly, surviving on what they grew, and the little income Maryam made from her herbal medicine practice. Still, Halima was content in her world, surrounded by her siblings and protected by her parents' care. She dreamed of a future where she could carry on her mother's legacy and one day pass it on to her own children. Despite the hardships, Halima's childhood held moments of joy. She would often join her brothers in the fields, playing games under the open sky, her laughter blending with the sounds of nature. She was close to her brothers, especially her youngest brother, Amin, who was only 2 years younger than her. The two shared an unbreakable bond, spending hours exploring the countryside, finding hidden paths and secret spots. She loved the smell of the soil, the rustle of the leaves, and the endless expanse of the fields that seemed to promise endless freedom. For her, Arzen was the whole world, a place where she felt safe and loved. But as Halima grew older, she began to notice that life in Arzen held limitations, particularly for girls. Her mother, though respected for her herbal knowledge, was rarely seen in public gatherings and often remained in the background, tending to the family and her work quietly. Halima saw that her future too seemed predetermined, tied to the family traditions and expectations of the community. Yet, she held on to her childhood dreams, believing that perhaps, one day, she would make her own path. Halima's innocence, her spirit, and her family's love defined her early years. But these years of quiet contentment and simple joys would be short-lived. Unbeknownst to her, fate was preparing to take her down a path that would challenge everything she knew and test the strength of her spirit in ways she could never have imagined. The first time Sheikh Ibrahim, the Imam, came to Arzen, it was an ordinary day. For most people in town, his visit was unremarkable. A respected figure from the city, someone beyond their daily lives, simply passing through. Arzen didn't often see people of his status. He was well known in urban religious circles, revered for his knowledge of Islamic law, and admired for his wealthy lifestyle. The townspeople observed him with a mix of curiosity and respect as he arrived at Halima's family home. He was tall, imposing, with a stern face and eyes that seemed to look right through people, leaving them feeling small. To Halima, who watched quietly from behind her mother, he seemed like a stranger from another world, someone who could never belong to the simple life she knew. Sheikh Ibrahim had come to see Maryam for her herbal remedies. Though he was an imam, he held a respect for traditional healing methods, and he'd heard from acquaintances that Maryam's skills were well regarded. As he entered the home, his presence filled the small space, his voice deep and commanding. He was polite but distant, focusing on the purpose of his visit and asking Maryam questions about her work with herbs. Maryam explained each plant and its purpose, the remedies she crafted for common ailments, and how she balanced her work with raising her children. Throughout the conversation, Sheikh Ibrahim's attention drifted toward Halima, who sat quietly by her mother, watching her with a respectful and curious gaze. Her youth, her shy demeanor, and her gentle manners struck him in a way that he hadn't expected. She was not like the other children he had seen in the city, who often seemed bold and distracted. Halima seemed focused, disciplined, and, in his eyes, unusually beautiful for her age. There was something about her innocence, her unguarded nature, that stirred an interest in him. Initially, Halima's parents didn't think much of the Imam's attention toward their daughter. They were grateful for his visit and eager to help him with whatever he needed. But as the days passed, Sheikh Ibrahim found reasons to return to their home. Sometimes he would request more medicine. Other times, he would simply come to visit under the pretense of needing advice on health matters. Each time, he would engage in conversation with Maryam, but his gaze would linger on Halima. Yusuf and Maryam, still respectful of his status and unsure of his intentions, felt honored by his visits. For them, it was a matter of pride to host a man of such high religious standing. Yet, in the background, Halima began to sense his unusual interest. She noticed the way he looked at her, the questions he asked her parents about her daily life, her work with her mother, and even her dreams. The attention made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't fully understand why. She was too young to grasp the implications of his interest, but she felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. She tried to avoid his gaze, to keep herself busy with chores whenever he visited, but his presence in their home left her feeling tense and uncertain. As his visits continued, whispers started circulating in Arzen. People began to notice that the Imam, a man of wealth and power, had taken a peculiar interest in this young girl from a modest farming family. Some speculated that he intended to help the family financially, while others guessed he might want to take Halima as a servant for his household. Yet, the more perceptive villagers sensed something more, an unsettling possibility that was almost too disturbing to voice aloud. For the first time in her life, Halima felt the weight of being observed, of being noticed in a way that made her question her own innocence and her place in her family's world. It was the beginning of a shift in her life, an unspoken tension that foreshadowed the difficult path that lay ahead. As Sheikh Ibrahim's visits to Halima's family became more frequent, he finally brought forward the real reason for his interest. One evening, after discussing remedies with Mariam, he turned to Yusuf and spoke plainly. He wanted to marry their daughter, Halima. The words, spoken with such ease, stunned both parents. They had known of child marriages in other communities, but it was not something they had considered for their own daughter, especially at her tender age of just 11. Halima's parents were caught between disbelief and discomfort. They respected the Imam's authority, but felt the proposal was too much, too soon. Sheikh Ibrahim, sensing their hesitation, began to elaborate on his intentions. He spoke about the importance of honoring God's will, of how marriage was a sacred duty, and of how he could offer Halima a life of comfort, stability, and religious guidance. His words were calculated, meant to reassure them, but his true intentions remained concealed behind his carefully chosen phrases. He reminded them of religious teachings that permitted child marriage under certain conditions, quoting passages and invoking beliefs that framed his offer as a benevolent act, rather than a selfish one. At first, Yusuf and Mariam resisted, asserting that Halima was still too young. They feared for her well-being, aware that she was still a child who had not even begun to understand the world. But the Imam persisted, bringing gifts each time he visited, fine cloth, coins, even rare foods that their family could rarely afford. He made promises of financial support, offering to ease the burdens of their simple life and take their daughter under his protection. His promises grew, each one more tempting than the last, as he painted a picture of security and prosperity for their family. He would send her to school, he said, ensure she was educated in religious and academic matters alike. Despite these promises, Halima's parents still struggled with the decision. They were not unaware of their own financial struggles. Yusuf had long worried about his ability to provide for all his children. The fields did not always yield enough, and Mariam's earnings from her herbal remedies were inconsistent at best. Sheikh Ibrahim's proposal offered a solution to their problems, a chance for a better life for all of them. Yet, there was a deep reluctance, especially from Mariam, who felt an instinctive protectiveness over her only daughter. Halima was precious to her, not just as a child, but as her apprentice, the girl who would one day inherit her craft. As Sheikh Ibrahim continued to visit, he wore down their resistance bit by bit. He was relentless, visiting them nearly every day, bringing new gifts, reminding them of the religious teachings that sanctioned his offer, until Yusuf and Mariam found themselves wavering. The pressure was mounting, and the Imam knew it. He knew how to appeal to their sense of duty, to their faith, and most of all, to their fears about the future. Eventually, his persistence paid off, and they began to seriously consider his proposal. But there was one voice left unheard in all of this: Halima's. She was never asked how she felt, never given a choice, or even the chance to express her fear and confusion. To her, the concept of marriage was a distant idea, something she associated with adults, with other people, not herself. She had no understanding of what marriage entailed, nor why someone as old as Sheikh Ibrahim would want her as a wife. She felt trapped, watching her future being decided by others, her own feelings invisible in the face of her family's growing resolve. Finally, after many sleepless nights and endless debates, Yusuf and Mariam gave in. They accepted Sheikh Ibrahim's offer, seeing it as a way to secure a future not just for Halima, but for their entire family. They believed that the Imam, with his wealth and influence, could provide a life that they themselves could not. It was a decision weighed down by a mixture of hope and desperation, a choice they hoped would lead to something better, even if it meant parting with their only daughter before she was ready. Halima's fate was sealed, her childhood exchanged for promises that would ultimately bring only sorrow and tragedy. Once Halima's parents accepted Sheikh Ibrahim's proposal, the entire household was thrown into a flurry of preparations. The upcoming wedding became the talk of Arzen, a spectacle of both excitement and unease. While child marriages were not unheard of, few had expected such a union between an 11-year-old village girl and an Imam from the city. For Halima, the days leading up to the wedding were filled with confusion, dread, and an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. She watched as her family bustled about, making arrangements as if she were merely a spectator in her own life. Her mother, Mariam, tried to reassure her, though her own heart was heavy. Mariam sewed Halima's wedding dress by hand, selecting a simple yet elegant fabric, a modest white cloth trimmed with delicate embroidery. Mariam had made dresses before, but this one felt different. With every stitch, she wrestled with her fears, hoping that her daughter would find happiness, or at the very least, comfort in the life ahead. She whispered quiet words to Halima about womanhood and duty, but her reassurances felt hollow, even to her. She knew, deep down, that Halima was not ready for the path she was about to walk. Youssef, meanwhile, focused on practical matters. He negotiated with local merchants for the wedding feast, arranging for foods that would make the day memorable. While Youssef was proud to be giving his daughter to a man of such status, he couldn't ignore the nagging guilt gnawing at him. He told himself that this was the best way to secure her future. But he, too, wondered if he was sacrificing his daughter's happiness for the family's welfare. To distract himself, he poured all his energy into preparing for the ceremony, convincing himself that a grand wedding would make up for any doubts he had. As the day approached, Sheikh Ibrahim sent more gifts, a show of his wealth and influence, meant to elevate the family's status in the eyes of the community. Golden bracelets, fine silks, and expensive perfumes arrived in carefully wrapped packages. The villagers, who rarely saw such luxury, began to look at Youssef and Mariam with a mixture of envy and admiration. Many praised them for arranging such an advantageous marriage, while others whispered among themselves, wondering if they were making a mistake. Some even expressed concern for Halima, though no one dared to voice these concerns openly. For Halima, the gifts and the preparations were bewildering and frightening. Each new item that arrived reminded her of what was coming, and each piece of jewelry placed on her tiny wrists felt like a shackle. She had no desire for gold or perfumes. She only wanted to stay with her family, to remain a child a little while longer. Her brothers noticed her unease, especially Amin, her closest sibling, who sensed her sorrow but didn't know how to comfort her. He tried to distract her with small jokes and familiar games, but even he couldn't lift the heavy silence that had settled over her. The wedding day finally arrived. Sheikh Ibrahim, dressed in lavish robes, arrived with an entourage, bringing with him a sense of authority and opulence that felt out of place in the humble village. He greeted Youssef and Mariam with formal respect, his demeanor a mixture of pride and satisfaction. To him, this marriage was not only a personal desire fulfilled, but also a display of his power and influence. He took pride in the fact that he could take such a young bride, seeing it as a reflection of his religious authority and his status in the community. The ceremony was modest by city standards, but extravagant for Arzen. Tables were set with dishes of lamb and rice, fruits and sweets, foods that Halima's family rarely enjoyed. Villagers gathered, some out of genuine celebration, others out of curiosity, watching as the quiet little girl in white became the Imam's bride. For them, it was a spectacle, a moment that blended the strange with the familiar, the sacred with the unsettling. Some of the women, mothers and grandmothers who had once been young brides themselves, looked at Halima with a sadness that they kept hidden. They, too, had known what it felt like to be handed over too young, and they feared for what she might face. When it came time for Halima to leave with her new husband, she felt a wave of fear wash over her. Her mother held her close one last time, whispering words of comfort that were laced with sadness. Mariam told her to be strong, to trust in God's will, but Halima felt more alone than ever. Her father avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the Imam, offering him formal words of gratitude. And her brothers, standing silently nearby, watched with a mix of confusion and loss, knowing that their sister's life was forever changed. As Halima was led away, she looked back at her family, her small, trembling figure framed against the familiar landscape of her childhood. She realized, in that moment, that everything she had known was now behind her. Her world had shifted irreversibly, and the life she was entering felt like a vast, frightening unknown. The celebration continued in Arzen, but for Halima, it marked the beginning of a new life, one that would test her courage and resilience in ways she was far too young to understand. Sheikh Ibrahim was a man whose life seemed steeped in power and piety. To the outside world, he was a respected religious leader, an imam with a reputation that stretched beyond Arzen to nearby towns and even cities. People revered him for his knowledge of religious texts and sought his guidance on matters both spiritual and worldly. He had held his position as an imam for many years, and his words were often taken as law. Yet, for all his respect in the public eye, the private life of Sheikh Ibrahim was complex and, for his wives and children, difficult. Sheikh Ibrahim had been married 3 times before he set his sights on Halima. Each of his wives had entered his household with hope and reverence, trusting that marriage to a man of such standing would bring them security and respect. However, life in the imam's household was governed by rules and expectations that were as rigid as they were unyielding. For Sheikh Ibrahim, marriage was not a partnership of equals, but rather a structure where he alone held authority. His wives were expected to follow his commands without question, to live by his rules, and to carry out their duties without fail. The first wife, Fatima, had been with him the longest. She was a quiet woman, obedient and dutiful, who had accepted her role in the imam's life without complaint. She had seen other wives come and go, each one hoping to find favor with the imam, only to discover that his affections were fleeting. Fatima had learned to live in silence, her days spent caring for her children and managing the household according to Sheikh Ibrahim's strict orders. She rarely ventured outside without his permission, and she raised her children to be obedient, instilling in them the same deference that had defined her own life. The second wife, Aisha, had once been spirited and hopeful, drawn to the imam by the promises of a stable life and a sense of purpose. But Aisha's vivacity had been worn down over the years by the demands of living under his authority. She had entered the marriage with dreams of contributing to the community, of working alongside her husband, perhaps teaching or helping the less fortunate. Yet, Sheikh Ibrahim had no interest in her ambitions. To him, Aisha's place was within the home, raising his children and supporting him without question. Over time, her spirit faded, her dreams slowly suffocating under the weight of her husband's control. By the time Halima entered the household, Aisha was a shadow of her former self, her once bright eyes now dulled with resignation. The third wife, Zainab, was younger and had been married to the imam only a few years before he approached Halima's family. Unlike Fatima and Aisha, Zainab had not yet fully submitted to her role. She often questioned Sheikh Ibrahim's commands, challenging his authority in ways that angered him but also intrigued him. Zainab's defiance was met with stern discipline. He used his religious authority to remind her of her place, asserting that obedience was a wife's duty. Zainab, however, was not easily subdued, and she often argued with him, even if it meant facing consequences. For her, marriage to the imam had been a lesson in disillusionment, an experience that had left her both resentful and isolated within the household. The children of Sheikh Ibrahim were raised under his stern guidance. They were taught to respect him without question, to obey without hesitation. The sons were expected to follow in his religious footsteps, while the daughters were groomed to be future wives, raised in the same strict environment that defined their mothers' lives. Love and affection were rare in their upbringing. Discipline and obedience were the pillars of their existence. The children respected their father out of duty, but few felt a close bond with him. He was a figure of authority rather than warmth, someone to be feared rather than confided in. For Sheikh Ibrahim, religion was both a source of comfort and a tool for control. He was deeply knowledgeable, but his interpretation of faith was rigid, leaving little room for empathy or understanding. In his eyes, his household was a model of religious adherence, a structure where his authority was absolute. He used religious texts to justify his actions, believing that his strict approach was in line with divine will. To him, his wives and children were not individuals with their own desires and dreams, but rather extensions of himself. bound to follow the path he set for them. The decision to marry Halima, an 11-year-old girl, was not driven by love or companionship. For Sheikh Ibrahim, it was a matter of pride and desire, a way to assert his status and fulfill his wishes. Halima's youth and innocence held a strange allure for him, something that he saw as both a testament to his influence and a fulfillment of his own beliefs. He viewed her as a new addition to his household, another wife who would be molded to fit his vision of an obedient partner. Her age was not a concern for him. In his mind, it was his right as a man and as an Imam to take her as his wife. As the days drew closer to the wedding, Sheikh Ibrahim felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he would soon bring Halima into his household. To him, this marriage was a symbol of his authority, his ability to shape lives according to his will. He believed that Halima, like his other wives, would learn her place, would submit to the life he planned for her. But what Sheikh Ibrahim did not understand, what he had overlooked in his confidence, was that Halima was not like his other wives. She was a child with dreams, fears, and a spirit that had not yet been crushed by the weight of obedience. In his arrogance, he assumed that she, too, would fall in line, never considering the possibility that her innocence might hold a strength he could not foresee. The day after her wedding, Halima stepped into a world that was foreign, harsh, and far removed from the only life she had ever known. The Imam's household was grand by the village's standards, filled with fine rugs, large rooms, and an air of formality that made her feel small and out of place. The servants moved about with silent efficiency, casting her fleeting glances filled with a mixture of pity and indifference. For a girl who had spent her days running freely in the fields, working alongside her mother in the small, cozy spaces of their modest home, this new environment felt cold and imposing. From the very first night, Halima was confronted with the harsh realities of her marriage. Sheikh Ibrahim was not gentle with her, treating her not as a young girl but as an adult wife, with all the expectations that entailed. The experience left her terrified, broken, and deeply confused. She cried herself to sleep, her tiny frame trembling with fear, but there was no one to comfort her, no one to ease her pain. In the days that followed, her fear only grew, turning into a heavy silence that hung over her like a shroud. She quickly learned that she could not express her pain or fear without facing stern reprimands from the Imam, who expected unwavering obedience and silence from his new wife. The Imam's household was governed by rules that Halima struggled to understand. She was not allowed to leave the house without permission, nor was she permitted to speak out of turn. Her movements were watched, her tasks were dictated, and any trace of her own will was swiftly subdued. Each morning, she was expected to rise before dawn, performing prayers and preparing herself for the day's duties. Her responsibilities were demanding and monotonous, a series of tasks meant to occupy her and keep her compliant. She was no longer the child who wandered freely, collecting herbs and learning her mother's craft. She had become a mere extension of the Imam's household, an existence defined by her service to him. Halima's relationship with the other wives was complicated. Fatima, the oldest wife, was kind but distant, treating Halima with a detached sympathy. She often watched Halima with a knowing sadness, her gaze filled with memories of her own youth, a time when she, too, had entered the household full of fear and hope. Fatima had long since resigned herself to her role, her spirit dulled by years of submission. She offered Halima quiet guidance, small gestures of comfort, but there was little she could do to ease the young girl's suffering. Fatima had learned to survive by remaining invisible, by accepting her place without question, and she feared that encouraging Halima would only bring more harm upon them both. Aisha, the second wife, was warmer, though equally constrained by her own experiences. She treated Halima like a younger sister, sharing whispered words of advice and caution when they were alone. Aisha understood the struggles Halima faced, and though she could not openly defy the Imam, she offered Halima small moments of kindness, brief reprieves from the oppressive atmosphere of the household. She warned Halima of the Imam's temper, telling her to remain silent, to avoid drawing attention to herself, to survive by submitting as they all had learned to do. For Aisha, Seeing Halima's pain was a reminder of her own crushed dreams, and while she wished for something better for the young girl, she felt powerless to change anything. Zainab, the third wife, was more outspoken and occasionally rebellious, though her defiance was carefully controlled. She saw Halima's innocence and youth as a stark contrast to the life they led, and it filled her with a simmering anger. Zainab was resentful of the Imam and his authority, and though she did not openly challenge him, she did not hide her disdain from Halima. She would sometimes take Halima aside and speak harshly of the life they were forced to live, her words laced with bitterness. Zainab warned her not to expect any kindness from Sheikh Ibrahim, telling her that survival meant surrendering her own dreams and desires. Yet, her defiance, however subtle, gave Halima a small sense of hope, a reminder that not everyone in the household had fully submitted. The children in the household, especially those older than Halima, treated her with a mix of curiosity and indifference. They had grown up under their father's rule, accustomed to the strict environment and wary of challenging his authority. To them, Halima was just another figure in the background, a new wife who had joined the household, someone who did not yet belong. Some of the younger children, however, were drawn to her, sensing her gentle nature. They would occasionally play near her, seeking her attention, unaware of the pain she carried. For brief moments when she was with the children, Halima felt a faint echo of her own childhood, a reminder of the simple joys that had once filled her life. In the quiet moments when she was alone, Halima's mind would drift back to her family, to the fields and the warm embrace of her mother's kitchen. She longed for the days when she had been free, when her life was filled with familiar routines and the gentle presence of her family. But now, those memories felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. She struggled to reconcile the reality of her new life with the innocence she had left behind, and a deep sadness settled within her. She prayed silently, hoping that somehow her suffering would end, though she had no clear idea of how or when. As the weeks turned into months, Halima's spirit grew quieter, her voice softer, and her will weaker. She moved through her days like a shadow, performing her duties without complaint, her mind numbed by the repetitive tasks and the constant fear of displeasing the Imam. She had come to understand that there was no escape, no reprieve from the life she had been thrust into. She was no longer a child. She had been transformed into something else, a young girl forced into the role of a wife in a world that showed her little kindness and even less mercy. In her darkest moments, Halima would sit alone, her eyes unfocused, her thoughts filled with memories of her family. She wondered if they missed her, if they regretted the choice they had made, or if they, too, had accepted her absence as part of the price for their own survival. Each night, as she lay in the cold silence of her room, she would whisper a prayer, a plea for freedom, though she did not know what that freedom would look like. All she knew was that the life she had been given was a life she could barely endure. And so each day, she drifted further into silence, her spirit worn thin by the relentless demands of a life she had never chosen. As time went on, Halima's despair deepened, turning her once bright eyes hollow and her gentle nature subdued. She lived each day under the oppressive weight of Sheikh Ibrahim's authority, her childhood memories fading, replaced by the harsh reality of her life as a young bride in his household. Her days blurred into a monotonous routine of duties, and her nights were filled with dread and silent tears. The light that had once defined her was slowly dimming, replaced by an overwhelming sense of isolation and entrapment. Her only solace came in the brief, quiet moments she could steal for herself, though even these were clouded by the knowledge that there was no escape. Despite her efforts to stay invisible, Halima's pain did not go unnoticed by the other wives. Fatima, Isha, and Zainab, though each resigned to their own burdens, shared silent glances of understanding with her. They too had once felt the same despair, the same desire for freedom that was now consuming Halima. Occasionally, Aisha or Zainab would pull her aside, offering whispered words of encouragement or guidance, but they could do little to alleviate the heavy burden she carried. They knew too well the futility of trying to change the Imam's will, for they had once tried and failed. Their quiet gestures of empathy were a reminder that Halima was not alone in her suffering. But it was a small comfort in the face of her growing hopelessness. One evening, as Halima lay awake, her thoughts drifting to memories of her mother's herbal teachings, an idea began to form. She remembered the plants her mother had shown her, the ones used for ailments, but also those that could harm if used improperly. Her mother had taught her how certain herbs, when combined, could become dangerous, even lethal. Halima's mind lingered on this knowledge, a knowledge she had never thought she would need in such a way. But desperation was a powerful force, and as the days wore on, the thought grew stronger, taking root in her heart. It was terrifying, yet oddly empowering, a glimmer of control in a life where she had none. Over the next few weeks, Halima began to carefully collect the necessary ingredients, slipping small amounts of each herb into the folds of her clothing whenever she could. She was careful not to draw attention to herself, hiding the herbs in her room and mixing them only when she was alone. She moved with quiet determination, her movements slow and calculated. Each step she took toward carrying out her plan filled her with both fear and resolve. She knew the risks, understood that discovery would mean severe punishment, but her suffering had reached a point where she felt she had little left to lose. The other wives, particularly Zainab, noticed a change in Halima. Her once timid manner was now marked by a strange calmness, a quiet resolve that puzzled them. Zainab, who had always been perceptive, began to suspect that Halima was planning something, though she dared not ask. She sensed that whatever was stirring within Halima was something deeply personal, something that could not be shared. Instead, she offered Halima silent support, hoping that whatever path the young girl chose would bring her some semblance of peace. One evening, when Sheikh Ibrahim returned home after his evening prayers, Halima prepared his tea as she always did. But this time, she added the deadly mixture she had carefully crafted, stirring it into the cup with a steady hand. She moved with an uncanny calm, her face expressionless, her eyes focused on the task at hand. As she carried the tea to him, her heart pounded, but her resolve remained unshaken. She placed the cup in front of him, her hands steady, her gaze fixed downward to avoid betraying any hint of her intentions. Sheikh Ibrahim took the cup without a second thought, sipping the tea as he often did, unaware of the poison that lingered within. Halima watched from a distance, her breathing shallow as she waited for the effects to take hold. She had anticipated this moment for so long, rehearsed it in her mind until it felt almost surreal. As she observed him, a sense of numbness settled over her, a detachment from the act she had just committed. For the first time since her marriage, she felt a strange, twisted sense of freedom, though she knew it would be short-lived. But then, something shifted within her, a realization of the enormity of what she had done. She felt a surge of fear, a dread of what would come next. The village would surely learn of the Imam's death, and she, the young bride, would be the first to fall under suspicion. The thought of facing the judgment of her community, the shame and horror that would follow, filled her with panic. She knew that the people of Arzen, who revered the Imam, would condemn her to death, and her family, already burdened with poverty, would be left to bear the shame of her actions. Overwhelmed by the gravity of her decision, Halima made one final, desperate choice. She returned to where she had saved a portion of the deadly mixture and poured it into a cup. With trembling hands, she raised it to her lips, drinking the poison that she had prepared. As the liquid burned its way down, she closed her eyes, surrendering to the darkness that awaited her. Halima's body was discovered the next morning, lying beside the Imam's lifeless form, her small frame curled in a final, silent act of defiance. The household erupted in chaos, and soon the entire village of Arzen would be consumed by the scandal and mystery surrounding the young girl's tragic end. But in that final moment, Halima had reclaimed a sliver of her life, a choice that was hers alone, even if it came at the ultimate price. The morning sun rose over Arzen, casting a quiet light over the village that had yet to wake to the tragedy waiting within Sheikh Ibrahim's home. The house, usually bustling with the sounds of servants and family members going about their daily tasks, was uncharacteristically silent. It was one of the younger children who first discovered the scene, wandering into the Imam's quarters and finding both his father and Halima lying still, side by side. The child's cries echoed through the house, drawing the attention of the other wives, servants, and eventually the townspeople. The villagers gathered quickly outside the Imam's home as word spread. At first, they could hardly comprehend the situation. Death had come in the night, claiming both a respected religious leader and a girl who had barely entered womanhood. The shock and disbelief hung thick in the air as neighbors exchanged fearful glances and whispered questions. The Imam was a powerful figure, and his death was both a personal tragedy for the community and a symbolic blow to the authority he represented. But alongside the grief, a murmur of suspicion began to rise. How could both the Imam and his young bride have died in the same night? What darkness had touched their lives so suddenly? Inside the house, the scene was stark and haunting. Sheikh Ibrahim's body lay motionless, his face frozen in an expression of shock and pain, evidence of the poison's cruel effect. Next to him lay Halima, her small form curled up as if in sleep, her face bearing a calmness that belied the turmoil that had defined her last days. Her hands were clasped over her chest, and for a moment she looked like a child resting peacefully. But to those who knew the truth, it was clear that this was no peaceful end. It was the final act of a girl who had been pushed beyond her limits. The wives gathered around, each one responding in her own way. Fatima, the oldest, knelt beside Halima's lifeless body, tears silently streaming down her face. She had known the suffering of a young bride all too well, had seen Halima's innocence shattered, and now felt the weight of a guilt she could not fully express. Aisha, standing to the side, clutched her hands to her chest, whispering prayers for Halima's soul, her mind racing with memories of the kindness she had tried to offer the girl. Zainab, however, felt a bitter mixture of sorrow and vindication. She had long resented the Imam's power, his control over their lives, and while she mourned Halima's tragic end, she could not ignore the sense of justice she felt in the Imam's death. For her, this final act was not just a tragedy, it was a reckoning. As the elders and local physician arrived, they began to assess the situation. The physician took samples and examined them further, and after a careful analysis, he confirmed his fears. Both the Imam and the young girl had ingested a deadly concoction, most likely a carefully prepared herbal poison. Halima's small, fragile body showed similar signs of poisoning as Sheikh Ibrahim's, though her expression in death was strangely peaceful, as if she had accepted her fate. The discovery of poisoning as the cause of death sent a shockwave through Arzen. People now knew that this was no accident, no mysterious illness. This was a deliberate act. Outside, the crowd grew, and people began speculating openly. Some defended Halima, saying that no child should be forced into such a life, that she had been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Others condemned her, speaking of the Imam's respect and authority, asserting that she had dishonored not only him, but the entire village. The elders, too, found themselves divided, unsure of how to proceed. This was not merely a family tragedy. It was a crisis that shook the community's faith in its own traditions, its practices, and the trust it had placed in its religious leaders. As the day wore on, the villagers struggled to make sense of what had happened, and grief gave way to a painful reflection. Halima's death, though wrapped in scandal, became a mirror for the people of Arzen, forcing them to confront the harsh reality of child marriage and the power dynamics that had enabled it. While some clung to their beliefs, insisting that the Imam had acted within his rights, others began to question whether such practices should continue. Was it right to marry off a child, to impose a life of submission and suffering upon someone who had not yet fully lived? For the first time, voices of dissent began to rise, not loudly, but with a quiet persistence that hinted at a potential shift. The village leaders, under pressure from both sides, decided to handle the matter delicately. They declared that Halima's actions would not be judged in the same way as an adult's. Instead, they chose to honor her life in silence, allowing her family to mourn without public condemnation. For Sheikh Ibrahim, however, a grand funeral was arranged, marking him as a revered figure whose death would be remembered with solemnity. Yet, beneath the formalities, the villagers knew that the Imam's legacy had been irrevocably tainted by the circumstances of his death. His authority, once unquestioned, had now become a subject of whispered doubts. As the day came to an end, Halima was laid to rest beside her family's humble plot, away from the grandness of the Imam's tomb. Her family, stricken by grief, buried her with quiet dignity, their sorrow marked by a mixture of regret and love. Her mother, Maryam, felt the weight of her daughter's loss most acutely, haunted by the knowledge that her own teachings of herbal medicine had in a way led to this end. Yusuf, her father, stood silently, his face a mask of sorrow, wondering if his decision to marry her off had been worth the cost. In the days that followed, life in Arzen returned to its quiet rhythms, but Halima's story lingered in the hearts and minds of its people. Her death became a point of reflection, a quiet protest against the unquestioned practices that had defined their lives. The tragedy of Halima's short life would not be easily forgotten. Her final act had stirred something within the community, planting a seed of doubt that would grow over time, challenging the very foundations upon which Arzen's customs were built. For the women of the village, especially the wives and daughters, Halima's story became a whispered tale of resilience and quiet rebellion. Mothers began to question the futures they had planned for their daughters, and young girls looked to Halima's memory as a reminder of their own desires for freedom. Though she was gone, Halima's spirit had left a mark, a legacy that lived on as a silent challenge to the ways of old. She had taken control of her fate in the only way she could, and in doing so had left an unspoken call for change that the people of Arzen could no longer ignore.